This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Tread lightly. This is more like it. What is it now? No one orders me around. What is it now? Ah, at last. Frostmourne hungers.
My life for Ner'zhul.
No one orders me around. Ah, at last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Your pain shall be legendary. This is more like it. Glory to the Scourge! Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. I'll make sure you suffer. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it. At last.
First blood.
This is more like it. At last. At last. This is more like it. You will know endless time. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. Oh, you suffer. At last. Now, Frostmourne. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Faithless coward. Finally. At last. Finally. Tread lightly. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Your pain shall be legendary. Faithless coward. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. I bow to your will. No one orders me around. At last. Finally. This is what. last. This is more like it. At last.
I'll make sure you suffer. You will know endless torment.
This is more like it.
Faithless coward.
At last. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers.
Greetings, my lord.
What is it? This is more like it. At last. Finally. Frostborn hungers. Finally.
I'll make sure you suffer.
At last. Finally. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it.
Your pain shall be legendary. You will know endless torment.
At last. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally.
Glory to the scourge.
At last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it.
Your pain shall be legendary.
Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. Finally. For the Lich King.
Insufficient.
At last. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Finally. At last.
You will know endless torment.
Frostborn hungers. Speak, fool. Finally. At last. Finally. At last. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. At last. Finally. At last.
Your pain shall be
For the Lich King.
You will know endless.
Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. For the Lich King. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. at last. Frostmourne hungers for the Lich King. This is more like it. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Now.
Your pain shall be legendary.
At last. Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Finally.
Glory to the scourge.
At last. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Finally.
Fate is gone.
Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Now, Frostmourne. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it.
How may I serve? What ails you?
What is it now? Finally. This is more like it.
I'll make sure you suffer.
Finally. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. Finally. At last.
Glory to the scourge.
Now, Frostmourne. Finally. At last.
Our allies'
Tread
town
lightly.
needs help.
This is more like it. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. At last.
I'll make sure you suffer. Glory to the scourge.
Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it.
You will know endless.
Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers. For the Lich King. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers.
Fate is coward.
last. Finally. Frostborn hungers. Ah, at last. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. Finally. For the Lich King. Ouch, you suffer. Glory to the Scourge. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Ah, at last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Fate is coward. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Ah, at last. For the Lich King. This is more like it. For the Lich King. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Ah, at last. This is more like it. Finally. Glory to the Scourge. Ah, at last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Ah, at last. No one orders me around. What is it now? Frostmourne hungers.
Welcome to our village.
No one orders me around. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Ah, at last. Finally. Now, Frostborn. Frostborn hungers. Ah, at last. Frostborn hungers. Ah, at last. Frostborn hungers. This is what you will not end this time. At last.
Killing spree.
Glory to the Scourge. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Ah, at last. This is more like it. Ah, at last.
What is your wish?
Tread lightly. This is more like it. Ah, at last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Ah, at last. Finally. For the Lich King. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Ah, at last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it.
No, not like that. Let me do it.
Greetings, my lord.
What is it now? Frostmourne hungers. No one orders me around. Glory to the Scourge! Finally. Glory to the Scourge! At last.
Killing spree. Double kill.
Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. What lich? Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it. At last.
Dominated.
This is more like it. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Fate.
Unstoppable. Double kill.
Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. You will be endless. Frostmourne hungers. Now.
Your pain shall be legendary.
Finally. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Now. I'll make sure you suffer. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last.
Wicked sick.
At last. This is more like it.
Our allies' town needs help. Our allies' town needs help.
What is it now? Finally.
Welcome to our village.
Speak, fool.
Aye?
Our allies' town needs
No
help.
one orders me around. Frostborn hunger. Frostborn hunger. Glory to the scourge. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. For the Lich King. Finally. This is more like it.
Double kill.
Frostborn hungers.
Which way?
I am ready.
Show me the path.
Speak, fool. Finally. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally.
Our allies' town needs help.
Glory to the scourge. Frostborn hungers.
Killing spree.
Ah, at last.
Our allies' town needs help.
This is more like it.
Our warriors have engaged the enemy. At last. I'll make sure.
Dominating.
Frostborn hungers.
Your pain shall be legendary.
For the Lich King. Finally. This is more like it.
Your pain shall be legendary.
For the Lich King. Finally. Ah, at last. Glory to the scourge. Oh, this is more like it. tread lightly. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it.
Which way?
No one orders me. At last. This is more like it.